In the early spring, the landscape had not yet decided what it would be. The frozen crust of winter still held the roads in the morning, but by midday a thick, clinging mud was born. It was a season of transition, and for the men inside the steel hulls that moved through it, a season of profound uncertainty. The front was not a line. It was a place where reports were hours old, where maps lied, and where the identity of a shape at 2,000 meters was a question answered with a guess. And that guess was then answered with a shell. A panzer unit, reduced by the long retreat to a handful of machines, had occupied a wooded ridge overlooking a valley. Their orders were simple: hold this position until the following evening, screening the movement of infantry regrouping to their rear. It was a delaying action, a battle of hours and meters. The commander of the lead tank, a veteran of 3 years named Steiner, scanned the opposite tree line through his field glasses. The air was cold and still. The only sounds were the creak of the machine's suspension settling and the faint metallic clicks from within the turret. Inside that turret, the air was thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and stale cigarette smoke. The loader, a man named Klaus, rested his forehead against the cool metal of the ready round he had pulled from the rack. His world was defined by touch and sound, the rough texture of the casing, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the gunner to his left, the static whisper from the commander's headset above and behind him. He was waiting. This was his primary function in these long stretches: to wait, cradling death, for the command that would set his body into a well-practiced, violent motion. Outside, the world was a silent, green-gray panorama. Inside, it was a capsule of held breath. A quiet tension had settled over the crew in the past hour. Radio traffic had hinted at armored probes in the sector. Shadows in the distant woodline had seemed to shift. Nothing was confirmed, but the unease was a tangible thing, a sixth member of the crew. It was the specific unease of the hunted, who knows a predator is near but cannot see its eyes. Steiner, the commander, lowered his glasses and spoke, his voice flat and compressed by the intercom. "Gunner, see the break in the trees, left of the lone birch, 1,100 meters." The gunner, Becker, shifted in his seat, his right eye pressing against the rubber cup of the telescopic sight. "Scanning," he murmured. Klaus felt his muscles tighten minutely. The waiting was over. Now it was the waiting for the order. "I have a silhouette," Becker said, his voice taking on the detached, technical tone of his role. "Low profile, sloped front glacis." Steiner raised his glasses again. The description fit a dozen possibilities, but in this sector, at this stage of the war, it narrowed to a probable few. His mind, trained by 1,000 such moments, began its calculus. The angular shape, the reported sightings, the known Soviet push in this region. The pieces clicked into a familiar, dreaded pattern. "It's a T-34, Steiner stated. It was not a question. It was the vocalization of a conclusion. "Gunner, high explosive. Loader, stand by." The command was a catalyst. In Klaus, it triggered the first step of his drill. He began to move the heavy shell in his arms, lining up the base with the breech. But a part of his mind, a part that operated separately from the training, remained fixed on the commander's words. "It's a T-34. The certainty in Steiner's voice was absolute. It was the kind of certainty that brooked no doubt, the kind that ended debates and began engagements. For Becker, the gunner, it was data. For Karl, the driver, listening below, it was a direction. For Klaus, it was a premise he was meant to accept. And he did accept it, initially. Why wouldn't he? Steiner had seen more combat than all of them combined. He had the better vantage, the field glasses. He carried the responsibility. The identification was a cornerstone of their tiny, rolling universe. Upon it, everything else would be built. The range calculation, the shell selection, the point of aim, the fire order. The destruction of the target was now a matter of procedure, a sequence of events as inevitable as the ticking of a clock. Klaus completed the load, the metallic clunk of the breech block closing, echoing in the confined space. "Up," he reported, his voice standard and clear. "He loaded," Becker confirmed, his hands making fine adjustments on his handles. "On target." All that remained was the final command. Steiner was observing, calculating the wind, The range, the value of the first shot. A hit could cripple the enemy. A miss would reveal their position, turning them from hunter into target. The moment stretched. Klaus, his task complete for now, shifted slightly. He had no periscope. His view of the outside world was limited to a narrow vision block, a slit of reality. He pressed his eye to it. The distant tank was a dark smudge against a darker background. He could not see details. He could only see the idea of it, the idea Steiner had given him. Enemy. T-34. Threat. This was the belief system of the armored fight. Identification was faith. The commander was the priest, and the crew were the congregation, preparing for the sacrament of fire. The assumption settled over them, a collective truth. The target in the trees was a Soviet medium tank. It was the next problem to be solved. It was the reason for their mourning, for their position on this ridge, for the cold tension in their hands. The universe had simplified into a binary state, them and it was about to cease existing. But the order did not come. "Hold fire," Steiner said, the words cutting through the expectancy. "Let's see if he moves. He might have friendlies screening him." And so they returned to waiting, but this was a different quality of wait. It was active, charged, a coiled spring. Before they had waited for something to happen. Now they waited to make something happen. The distinction was everything. Klaus kept his eye to the vision block. The smudge did not move. The birch tree beside it swayed in a faint breeze. The silence expanded, filling the tank, pressing in from the outside world. Minutes passed. They were long, granular minutes. Klaus could hear the rustle of Steiner's jacket as he shifted above him. He could hear Becker's slow, controlled exhale. He could hear the faint hum of the electrical systems. His own breathing sounded loud in his ears. The initial adrenaline-sharp focus began to soften, to blur at the edges. The target was no longer an imminent threat. It was a static part of the landscape, a puzzle piece that refused to move. The mind, deprived of immediate action, began to wander in the silence. Klaus thought of nothing in particular. He thought of the cold of the shell casing against his chest. He thought of the damp smell of the mud outside. He thought of the silence. It was a deep, almost physical silence, broken only by the occasional crack of a distant rifle shot. So far away it could have been a twig snapping. This was the true environment of their war, not the roaring chaos of the charge or the desperate fury of close defense, but this, the long, silent observation, the war of perception. Who saw whom first? Who interpreted the shadows correctly? Who waited 1 minute longer? Steiner occasionally muttered range corrections or asked Becker for confirmation of the target's stillness. The intercom crackled once with a query from another tank in their platoon, positioned farther down the ridge. Steiner responded in terse, coded phrases. The wait was a shared experience, a collective holding of breath across 4 steel boxes on a hill. For Klaus, deprived of a clear task, the waiting became a form of meditation. His eyes, tired of staring at the indistinct smudge, began to trace the edges of it. He looked at the space around it. He looked at the ground behind it. His vision, unfocused from intense concentration, began to register impressions rather than facts. And it was in this state, this passive, silent receptivity, that he first noticed the smoke. It was a tiny detail, a triviality. From the rear of the distant tank, a thin gray plume whisked into the air. It was exhaust. Of course it was exhaust. The engine would be idling or running at low power to keep systems active. It was normal. It was expected. Klaus had seen it 1,000 times from their own machines, from allies, from captured vehicles. It was background noise in the visual field. Yet he kept looking at it. There was nothing else to look at. The plume was faint, almost transparent against the gray sky. It rose in a lazy vertical column before dissipating. It was thin. The word formed in his mind without urgency. It was not a judgment, merely an observation. The exhaust was thin. He thought of the T-34s he had seen before, the ones they had fought, the ones they had abandoned in fields. Their diesel engines, under strain or cold start, belched a thicker, darker, oilier smoke. A smoke that clung to the air. This was different. A doubt, soft as the plume itself, uncurled in his mind. It was not a challenge. It was a whisper. That's not right. He dismissed it. He was a loader, not a commander. His expertise was in the weight of shells, the smooth motion of the breach, not in the identification of enemy vehicles at extreme range. Steiner had said it was a T-34. Steiner knew. The doubt was a product of the silence, of the boredom, of a mind creating patterns where none existed. He almost spoke. He almost said, "Commander, the exhaust looks off." But the words died in his throat. To question Steiner was not just a breach of protocol, it was a breach of the fragile trust that held their tiny world together. In the tight, dangerous universe of the tank, doubt was a contagion. Once introduced, it could weaken everything. He held his tongue. The moment passed, but the observation remained, a seed planted in the quiet soil of his mind. He continued to watch. The tank did not move. The smoke continued its thin, steady thread. The silence deepened. It was now a heavy woolen blanket over the scene. The tension of imminent engagement had bled away, replaced by the dull ache of sustained vigilance. Becker's shoulders, visible in the cramped space, had slumped slightly. Steiner's updates became less frequent. Klaus found his thoughts drifting again, away from the ridge, away from the war. He thought of a morning in a different forest, years ago, before uniforms and steel. He had been walking with his father, a forester. They had been tracking a deer. His father had stopped him with a hand on his shoulder, pointing not at the animal, but at the mist rising from a patch of sun-warmed ground ahead of it. "See how it moves?" his father had whispered. "Still air. The deer hasn't passed through it yet. We wait." It was a lesson in patience, in reading the small signs, in understanding that the truth was often revealed not by the thing itself, but by the space around it. The memory faded, but the sensation it evoked lingered. The hyper-awareness of the environment, the trust in subtle clues. His eyes drifted back to the wisp of smoke. It was just a wisp, but in the profound, stretching silence of that armored weight, it became a focal point. The wrongness of it, the thinness, refused to leave him. It was a single note of discord in a scene Steiner had declared harmonious. More minutes piled upon the previous ones. The wait was now measured in quarter hours. The initial mission clarity had fogged over. Were they waiting for the target to move? For another target to appear? For orders to disengage? The purpose had dissolved into the simple, grinding act of remaining in place, watching. For Klaus, the entire world had narrowed to the circle of his vision block and the pale gray thread that spiraled up from behind a dark shape. It was a thread that seemed to him to be tugging at the fabric of Steiner's certainty. The realization did not arrive with a shout or a shock. It did not break the silence. It grew from within it. It was a compounding of details. The thin smoke, the absolute stillness of the vehicle. A trained crew would rarely sit exposed for so long without some minor adjustment of position. The way it was positioned, not hull down for protection, but seemingly parked in a clearing. Klaus's mind, worn smooth by the long wait, began to connect these points not as a soldier analyzing a threat, but as a man solving a quiet riddle. The thought formed, complete and cold. That is not a tank waiting to fight. That is a tank that cannot fight. He saw it now not as a T-34, but as a shape. A piece of battlefield debris, perhaps? A wreck moved into position as a decoy. Or more likely, a damaged vehicle abandoned by its crew, its engine just alive enough to idle, to produce that faint, insufficient plume. A T-34's powerful diesel, even idling roughly, would show more. This was the pitiful smoke of a different engine, a smaller engine, a gasoline engine. The realization was a silent interior earthquake. The foundation of the past hour, the confirmed identification, the targeting solution, the imminent engagement, cracked and fell away. They were not staring down the barrel of an enemy gun. They were staring at a ghost, a lure. And if it was a lure, then the question immediately presented itself, chilling in its implication. What was it luring their attention away from? Klaus's breath caught. His mouth was dry. He knew he had to speak now. The weight of his silence, once a simple act of discipline, had become a danger. Yet still he hesitated for one final, endless second. To speak was to shatter the commander's reality. It was to say, "You are wrong." In the hierarchy of their steel world, this was a cardinal act. The consequences of being wrong himself were unthinkable. He would be ridiculed, his judgment forever suspect. But the consequences of staying silent, if his new fragile belief was right, were lethal. He looked away from the vision block, up into the dim interior of the turret. He could see the bottom of Steiner's leather jacket, the back of Becker's helmet. "Commander," he said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears, hoarse from disuse. "Report," Steiner replied, his tone distracted, still fixed on the tree line. Klaus swallowed. "The exhaust plume, sir, from the target, it is very thin." There was a pause, not a silence of ignorance, but a silence of processing. Steiner did not dismiss it. He did not affirm it. The observation was simply laid into the space between them. After a moment, Steiner's voice came again, quieter. "Explain." "It is not diesel smoke, sir. Not like a T-34. It is like a gasoline engine, a light vehicle, or a damaged one." Another pause, longer this time. The intercom seemed to hum with the tension of unspoken thoughts. Then, without a word, Steiner shifted above him. Klaus heard the soft scrape of the field glasses being raised again. He could almost feel the commander's gaze shifting, no longer looking at the target, but around it, through it, reevaluating the entire picture with this new, tiny, and potentially critical piece of information. The realization moment was not Klaus's alone. It was now a shared, dawning comprehension, traveling from the loader in the dark interior, up to the commander in the cupola, and spreading to the gunner who heard the exchange. The confirmed T-34 dissolved before their mind's eyes. What remained was a question mark, and the vast, silent, and suddenly menacing emptiness of the flanking terrain to their east, which they had been ignoring for the better part of an hour. Steiner did not congratulate Klaus. He did not thank him. In the economy of survival, there was no time for that. The new hypothesis demanded a new action, and that action was defined not by firing, but by a continued, and now acutely focused, restraint. "Gunner," Steiner said, his voice low and precise. "Shift sector. Right flank. Tree line at 800 meters. Scan slowly." "Shifting," Becker responded. The mechanical whir of the turret traversed a startlingly loud sound in the quiet. The great gun began to swing away from the decoy, its menace now pointed at empty, shadow-dappled woodland. "Driver, be ready to reverse on my mark." "Ready," came Carl's voice from below. The decision was made. They would not fire. They would not reveal their position by engaging a meaningless piece of wreckage. The 90 seconds that followed Klaus's report were the most intense of the long wait. They were no longer waiting for something. They were waiting against something. Every shadow in the new sector was a potential muzzle flash. Every rustle of the wind in the pines was the grind of a track. The silence was no longer empty. It was pregnant with threat. Klaus, his role reverted to that of pure waiting, felt a cold sweat on his back. He had spoken. The die was cast. If he was wrong, they had wasted critical attention. If he was right, he was right. It was Becker who saw it first. A flicker of movement, a solid shape sliding between two thick trunks. Not a tank silhouette, but the lower hull of one, well concealed, having used the long minutes of their fixation on the decoy to creep into an ideal firing position. "Contact," Becker hissed. "Right flank. Hull down. Tiger, I see the muzzle brake." A Tiger, a heavy tank with a gun that could punch through their frontal armor at this range. It had been stalking them, using the decoy to hold their gaze while it maneuvered for a killing shot from the side. They had been seconds, perhaps one more sweep of the gunner's sight away from presenting it a perfect, stationary target. Steiner's response was instantaneous. "Driver, reverse. Now! Gunner, smoke at the decoy position on the way." The engine roared. The tank lurched backwards, crunching through underbrush. Becker fired a single smoke round that burst with a dull thump in the clearing near the abandoned vehicle, throwing up a dense white cloud. It was not an attack. It was a curtain, a gesture of confusion and concealment. From the right flank, a bright flash, and a fraction of a second later, a deafening crack as the Tiger's shell passed through the space their tank had occupied moments before, exploding against a tree on the ridge behind them with a violent geyser of wood and dirt. But they were already moving, reversing into the deeper cover of the woods at the crest. The enemy's ambush was spoiled. The first crucial shot had missed. The engagement would continue, but on terms less disastrous than a catastrophic side penetration. They had been given a chance to fight another minute, another hour, because for 90 seconds they had chosen not to fire. The consequence of Klaus's doubt, of his decision to finally voice it, was not a victory. It was the avoidance of a certain death. It was the preservation of their machine and their lives for a little while longer, in a war where the accounting was done in minutes and meters. The battle in the valley continued for the rest of the afternoon, a confused skirmish of maneuver in long-range fire. But its decisive moment had already happened, in silence, inside a single turret centered on a wisp of smoke and a loader's hesitation. By evening, the Panzer unit had executed its orders. It had delayed, and it had disengaged, falling back to a new line. Their tank, scarred by shrapnel and small arms fire, but intact, sat in a farmer's field under a twilight sky. The crew was exhausted, the adrenaline of the day replaced by a deep, bone-aching weariness. Klaus sat on the ground, his back against the cold steel of a track link. He smoked a cigarette, his hands steady now. He replayed the hours in his mind, not the crash of shells or the roar of the engine, but the long middle stretch, the waiting, the silence that had grown so deep he could hear the faint, wrong note within it. He thought of the threat of smoke, so insignificant, so easily dismissed. It had been a whisper in a silent room, and he had, almost by accident, learned to listen. Steiner walked over, his face grimy and lined with fatigue. He stood for a moment, looking not at Klaus, but at the darkening horizon where the ridge lay. He then reached into his tunic and pulled out a small silver flask. He unscrewed the cap, took a short sip, and without a word handed it to Klaus. Klaus took it. The liquor was harsh and warm. He nodded his thanks, a small, tight motion. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The gesture was the entire conversation. It was an acknowledgement. Not of heroism, but of attention. In their world, that was the highest currency. The war did not change. The retreat continued. The vast, impersonal forces of armies and nations ground on. But within that machine, within the small human spaces between the orders and the explosions, the story of the war was also written in these quiet, individual moments. Moments of perception challenged, of certainty doubted, of a decision made not to act, to hold fire, to wait one more second, to look once more. The thin smoke had dissipated hours ago, lost in the general haze of the battlefield. The decoy tank, whoever had placed it there, was just another piece of scrap metal in a landscape littered with it. The Tiger that had fired on them was now just another anonymous threat in a long column of threats. But for the man who had seen the smoke, the lesson remained, not as a dramatic tale of combat, but as a quiet understanding. The most important things were often not announced. They were implied. They lingered in the margins, in the silences, in the details that did not fit the story you had been told. And sometimes the single most powerful action was to do nothing at all, to buy 90 seconds of hesitation, and in that pause to let the real world, in all its danger and truth, reveal itself.